Hello and welcome to the first in a series of videos on Sitecore MVC. My name is Martina and I'll be taking you through part 1, Getting Started. Before we do, a few prerequisites. Although the examples we're going to be using in this video are quite simple, it helps if you are already familiar with the Sitecore CMS and some of the associated terminology, such as layout, rendering, and item. It also helps if you've had some exposure to the MVC programming model, but this is not a must. If you do want to find out more about ASP.NET MVC in general, I can highly recommend the Pluralsight videos, which are freely available on the ASP.NET website. Finally, if you hear me making reference to the Sitecore MVC Contrib project, I'm talking about this publicly available GitHub repository. It extends the base Sitecore MVC implementation and solves some of the common problems. It is a great resource and something you should definitely check out when you feel more comfortable with Sitecore MVC. In this video, we're going to talk about what Sitecore MVC actually is, especially in comparison to regular ASP.NET MVC, which a lot of you are already using. We're also going to look at when it's appropriate to use Sitecore MVC over its web forms counterpart. Then we're going to get straight into installing and configuring an instance of Sitecore MVC and setting up a project to work with it. We're then going to create a layout and statically bind a view to it, and look at view and controller renderings in turn. Finally, we're going to look at Razor and some of the Sitecore-specific helpers available to you. So what is Sitecore MVC? It was introduced in November 2012 as part of Sitecore 6.6, and as of 7.1, we will be supporting MVC 4. It introduced native support for the Model View Controller programming model, and the reason I phrase it like that is because it is a little bit different. One of the key differences is that it operates alongside ASP.NET Web Forms on a per-request basis. In practice, what this means is that if you wanted to, you could have a site where some pages were handled by MVC and others were handled by Web Forms. Let's look at that in more detail. This diagram, which I borrowed from the internet, shows the execution process of a regular ASP.NET MVC application. A request comes in and is routed to a controller. An action is invoked, which invokes a method, and in that method you might do something with a model or a view bag if that's how you roll. That's then passed on to a view and rendered back to the browser as HTML. This diagram shows how Sitecore handles a request. A request comes in and goes to the HTTP request pipeline. That'll then determine if the request matches a standard MVC route. If it does, it's an MVC request and it's handled as a regular MVC route would be in an ASP.NET MVC application. If it doesn't match an MVC route, Sitecore will try to resolve that item's layout. If there is a layout, it'll ask, does that layout match the MVC extension setting, which you can see here? If it does, it's an MVC request, otherwise it's a Web Forms request. If no layout has been specified, Sitecore will look at the controller field on the item and see if a controller has been specified. If that controller can be found, it's an MVC request and is executed as you would expect, with a controller going to an action where you do something with a model and return a view. If not, it's a Web Forms request and that'll return a layout not found error. Other than the fact that you can use MVC and Web Forms in the same application, there are two other key differences between Sitecore MVC and .NET MVC. A Sitecore page is assembled from components. In Web Forms, those components are usually sublayouts or ASCX files. But in Sitecore MVC, you can use something called a view rendering. A view rendering represents an MVC view, and you can bind as many view renderings to a page as you want. More importantly, you do not need to create a controller. You can also use a controller rendering, where you specify a controller and a view to return. Again, because Sitecore pages are built up from components, you'll find that if you have several of these controller renderings on a single page, you are executing the controller model view interaction several times per page load, which is not the case in a traditional MVC application. We'll look more at both view and controller renderings later on in this video. When is it appropriate to use Sitecore MVC over Web Forms? You'll find that the reasons are the same as the ones that might motivate you to choose MVC over Web Forms generally. For example, you might require fine-grained control over markup if you're building a mobile application. You might require testability, and Web Forms is notoriously hard to test. You might have view state concerns, or MVC might just be the preferred development approach for your team. Finally, if you are migrating an existing MVC application, it's better to choose Sitecore MVC than to rewrite everything for web forms. For the rest of this video, we'll be doing a number of demos. First of all, we'll install and configure an instance of Sitecore MVC and prove it works by creating an MVC layout. We'll then create the Visual Studio project we'll be working with for the remainder of the video. After that, we'll look at view and controller renderings in turn and some of the Sitecore-specific Razor helpers available to you. To install Sitecore MVC, download the Sitecore installer from the Sitecore Developer Network. I have downloaded the latest version of the Sitecore 7 installer here and notice that there's nothing MVC specific about it. Run the installer and configure your instance as normal. I have already started. When you get to the IIS website step, click the Advanced button in the lower right-hand corner. You will notice that Enable Sitecore ASP.NET MVC integration is checked by default. Notice also that the requirements, in this case .NET 4 and MVC 3, are written below the checkbox. If you do not want to install Sitecore MVC, just uncheck the checkbox. Continue to install the instance as you normally would. I've already installed an instance of Sitecore with MVC enabled, so let's go and have a look at the web root of that instance. I'll now show you what has happened on the file system as part of enabling Sitecore MVC. The active web.config contains additional MVC-specific configuration, but notice that there is a web.config.webforms in the site root as well. If you want to disable MVC, use this web.config file instead. There are also a number of MVC-specific DLLs in your bin folder. The main one is called Sitecore.mvc, but you've also got experienceeditor.dll, which relates to the page editor, a device simulator DLL, which relates to a particular page editor feature, and an MVC-specific analytics DLL, which integrates Sitecore MVC with the DMS. Finally, there are a number of additional configuration files in appconfig include. These match the DLLs that we just looked at over here, but notice that by default the analytics configuration is disabled. This is the default Sitecore homepage, and although we've enabled MVC, this is still using an ASPX layout. I'm going to change it to use a view, and I'm going to do that the quick way and worry about creating a Visual Studio project later. So I'm going to go into the site web root. I'm going to right click and I'm going to insert a new folder called Views. Inside that folder, I'm going to create another folder called Layouts. And inside that, I'm going to create a file called sample.cshtml by going to New, Text Document, Sample, CSHTML. I'm then going to open that file in Visual Studio. Go to Visual Studio, File, Open. There it is. Inside this file, I'm going to use a very simple example of a razor. So I'm going to type today's date is, and then I'm going to use the @ symbol, date time, today, to short date string. Then I'm going to save that. The next step is to make Sitecore aware of this file. I'm going to use Sitecore Rocks, and for those of you who haven't used Sitecore Rocks before, it is a Visual Studio plugin that lets you manage all your Sitecore instances within Visual Studio. I've got my MVC3 instance here. If I expand master, I can see everything as though I would be in the content editor. So I want to make this home item here use this sample.cshtml rather than its current layout. And I know that it is using the sample layout here. So I'm going to double click on that. And instead of this sample layout path, I'm going to use the file we just created, which is views layouts sample.cshtml. And I'm going to save that. I'm then going to publish the master database. And to do that, I could just do Control-Shift-Spacebar. I get this commandy interface and type publish. And from this list, I can choose Smart Publish Database. I'm going to click OK, go back to my browser, and refresh this page. You might see this error, and that's fine, we can fix that. The reason it is throwing this error is because it doesn't have the configuration to know that it's supposed to act like a view. So what we're going to do is, I've got a sneaky file here, which is an additional web config, and if we look at it, you'll see it has configuration to do with Razor, and you can get this file from the Sitecore MVC contrib project that I mentioned at the start of the video. I'm going to copy this file, go back to my web root, and add it into the views folder here. I'm then going to go back into Visual Studio, make a small change in my file, save, go back to the browser, and refresh. And as you can see now, it's working and the Razor is resolving. So we've now proven that MVC is working, and in the next part of the video, we're going to look at setting up a Visual Studio project to work with this website, and also how to create a view and controller rendering. I'm back in Visual Studio, and now I want to create a project to work with this website. I'm going to go to File, New Project. I'm going to choose the ASP.NET MVC3 web application. I'm going to call it MVC, install it in a default location, and click OK. I'm going to choose an empty ASP.NET MVC application and wait for it to load. Once I've got the default folder set up, I'm going to delete webconfig, and that's because I don't want it to overwrite Sitecore webconfig. Because I want to keep the sample.cshtml file I created earlier, I'm going to copy that, its folder structure, and the additional web config into the project. So I'm going to go into the web root, copy both of these into the views folder. There we go. Finally, I'm going to add some references to the Sitecore specific MVC DLLs. I've actually prepared those here in libraries. I'm going to copy that folder into my MVC project. Don't actually need to see it, so I'm going to exclude it from the project. I'm going to expand references and add reference. I'm going to browse, select the DLLs, and click OK. I now have a reference to Sitecore kernel and Sitecore MVC. Now you'll notice that the project I've got and the website I've got are not in the same folder. I've created the project outside of the web root. The reason I've done this is because it's much easier to version control, and if I wanted to upgrade Sitecore at any point, I don't have to mess around in my project folder at all. So in order for this code that I do here to be moved into the website, I'm going to create a publish profile. And this is a Visual Studio specific publish. It's nothing to do with Sitecore. And to create one of those, I right click on my project, choose publish, go to new, create a new profile called MVC. In the publish method, I choose file system, click the little ellipsis, and choose local IIS here in the top left hand corner, and choose MVC3, which is my Sitecore instance. If I now publish, what it's going to do is build the project, as you can see here, and copy everything into the destination folder, which will be the web root for that IIS site. Let's just check that it actually worked. We appear to have an error. And this is because we've overwritten the global.asx that Sitecore provided, so let's just go and remove that from the project as well. So I'm going to expand MVC, remove the standard global.asx, go into my web root here, which is in websites, MVC3. And I want to make sure I restore this global ASAX to the Sitecore one. I've got a fresh Sitecore zip here, so all I'm going to do is just drag and drop to restore it to the one that Sitecore provided. Yes. If I go to the browser now and refresh, I no longer see that error. So what we've done in this part of the video is that we've created a MVC project that we're going to use to build views and controllers, and we've created a publish profile that moves the files we create here into the web root. And the publish button, for those that don't know, is this little one here, and you can enable it by right-clicking in the toolbar and going to web one-click publish, and you'll get this little toolbar here. In the next part of the video, we're going to create a view rendering and both statically and dynamically bind it to our sample layout. I'm back in Visual Studio, and now I want to create a view rendering. So the first thing I want to do is to make sure that my project that I created earlier is connected to this Sitecore instance. And the way I do that is to right-click on the project, go to the Sitecore option at the very bottom and click Connect. Then choose my MVC3 instance and click OK. And the reason I'm doing that is because it gives you a number of shortcuts. So when you're creating a rendering file, it'll also prompt you to create a rendering item, so you don't have to do that separately. So let's look at that in action. I'm going to right click on my views folder in the project. I'm going to add new item, and in the Sitecore option here, I'm going to expand, choose MVC, and choose MVC partial page with eraser. And I'm going to call that page header and click OK. And if we just wait a second, Sitecore should prompt me, there we go, to create a corresponding item. So I'm going to do that inside renderings. Yes. And what it's going to do is create a rendering with exactly the same name as the file. So if I expand renderings, you can see the page header item here. As you can see, there is already a model directive at the top of the page, and the model is of type sitecore.mvc.presentation.rendering model. I'm going to use this model to output some properties from the context item. So let's type in model.item.name, has a title of model item fields, and I know that there's a field called title on that home template. Now that we've created this view rendering and added something to it, we need to make sure that it's bound to our sample.cshtml somehow. So let's open back up that CSHTML file. Let's add the Sitecore MVC directive at the top. Now we're going to use a Sitecore specific razor helper. So if I do HTML here, and Sitecore, there is a view rendering method here. And if I specify the path to the view rendering that I just created, views page header, that is how you statically bind a rendering in Sitecore MVC. So let's publish that, a Visual Studio publish. And what I'm expecting to see now is that the page header content here, it'll let me open it, is going to appear on the layout in this location. And refresh. And there it is. And you can see that it's resolved the item name to home and the title to Sitecore. So that's fine for something like a page header, which is always going to appear in the same location. But let's look at how you do dynamic binding now. Let's go back to Visual Studio. Let's remove this static binding and go HTML, Sitecore, and find the placeholder. Give it a name. This is exactly like using SC colon placeholder, and I'm going to call it content and save that. Let's go to our home page. Let's do Control U to open presentation details. Might be Control Shift U actually. And let's remove all of these non-MVC renderings. Just going to delete them. Let's instead add our rendering, which was the page header rendering. There it is. And let's add it to the content placeholder. So if I click this little icon up here, it'll take me to properties. And I can choose the content placeholder key because that's what we specified on sample CSHTML here. If I then do a Sitecore publish so that this file gets updated, what I should see now is that I've got the sample layout, which is pointing to my sample.cshtml file, and this view rendering bound to this placeholder. Let's also publish so these changes take effect. Control Shift Space, Publish, Smart Publish Database, wait for a few moments, and if we refresh, see the page looks identical, but now this is a dynamically bound component. So if I move that placeholder around a bit, let's go back to sample, let's cut that and move it above the little date time. Do another Visual Studio publish, go back to the browser and refresh. It's now bound to the top of the page. So that's how you do dynamic binding with a view rendering. It's very similar to the way you do it with web forms. The syntax for placing the placeholder is just slightly different. And as you can see, we have not created a controller yet. Before we move on to creating a controller rendering, let's refactor this view rendering a little bit. And the reason I want to do that is because the syntax we have used here in the page header rendering, this does not support the page editor because I'm going straight to the raw value of the title field. So what we want to do instead is use a Sitecore helper, which is similar to the field renderer.render method. And that helper is Sitecore field, and then you give the name of the field, which is title. If you use this method, or this helper rather, you are ensuring that the value is editable in the page editor. So let's save that and deploy it or publish it. And let's go into the page editor. I'm going to do it this way because page preview doesn't actually work as expected if you go to it from the from Sitecore Rocks. So I'm going to go to Sitecore, page editor here. And don't worry about this is actually my fault. And what's happened is I haven't actually created a valid HTML page. So let me go back to Visual Studio and fix that. As you can see, there's no HTML or body tag. Just going to add one in. And a body tag as well. Save and Visual Studio publish that or deploy. Refresh the page. You can see the page editor is now working. And if we hover over this title field, you can see that page editor is supported. I can change this, my title, and save. So by using that helper, rather than accessing the raw value, we're supporting the page editor straight away. Something else that's interesting to note here is that I can actually select this component just as I would a normal sub layout or XSLT rendering, for example. So I can move this around the page just as I could in web forms. So page editor is fully supported in Sitecore MVC. In the next and final part of this video, we'll look at creating a more complex controller rendering. For the final part of this video, I'm going to create a controller rendering, and because no video tutorial would be complete without a Hello World example, I'm going to create a Hello World controller. Now this process is very similar to how you would create a controller in Vue in a regular MVC application. So first of all, create your controller. I'm going to right click and add a new controller, and I'm going to call it Hello World controller. And that controller only has one action result, which is index, and that returns a view. So to return a view, I need to actually create one, and because this is the Hello World controller, I'm going to need a Hello World subfolder under views. So I'll right click and add new folder called Hello World. In there, I'm going to create a view called index. So I'm going to add, and I'm going to go to new view here rather than new item, because I don't need a definition item in Sitecore when I'm creating a controller rendering, not for the view. I will need one for the controller, and that's the next step. First of all, I'm going to create a view. I'm going to call that index, and it's going to be a partial view. Click add. And in that view, so that we can see something, I'm going to say hello from the controller. Today's date is date time today, too short date string. Now the final step here is to make Sitecore aware of this controller which is returning this view. And to do that, I go to renderings in Sitecore Rocks, right click and add controller rendering here. And I'm going to call it Hello World controller. Or actually, it doesn't matter what I call it, I can call it page content. In here, there are two fields that I want to fill in, and they are Hello World controller, which is the name of my controller, and the controller action is index. I save that. So what's happening now is you're saying, when you encounter this rendering, I want you to execute this controller and return this action. So let's go and add this to our home page presentation details. So I'm going to click on the home page, Control-Shift-U to presentation details, add rendering, select the page content rendering, choose the content placeholder, exactly as we did for the view rendering, and publish everything. I also need to remember to do a deploy, otherwise these files will not appear in the file system. So I'm going to do that. Let's go and refresh our page, and we're now expecting to see the page header view rendering with the page content view controller rendering beneath it. The reason we have an error here is because I made a slight mistake. I'm going to go back into Visual Studio, going to go to the page content controller rendering. We don't actually need to say the word controller, just Hello World will do. Let's save that and publish. You can use a fully qualified name if you want. That is with a namespace, but you don't need the word controller there. Let's try again. And now it's working as expected. I can select the page header view rendering, and I can also select the page content controller rendering on the same page. So there we have a dynamically bound controller rendering. And remember what I said at the start of the video, if you have several of these controller renderings per page, you are executing the controller model view process several times per page load, which makes it slightly different from a standard MVC application. Before we finish, we're going to refactor this controller slightly. We're going to make it return a strongly typed view rather than a generic one. So let's go back into Visual Studio. Let's open the controller, and let's put date time now in instead, which means when we get to this view, the model needs to be a date time at the very top. And that means that we can use model rather than having to do date time. And of course, you can do this with a Sitecore item or one of your own custom models. It works exactly as it does in a standard MVC application. Let's deploy that and refresh, and nothing should change. There we go, it's identical. You can still select it. Whether you use a view or controller rendering depends on what you need. A view rendering gives you an XSLT-like development experience with good support for things like debugger and IntelliSense and access to the .NET API without having to do these extension classes. However, a controller rendering offers a cleaner approach, one that better honors the separation of concerns principle that underpins the MVC pattern in general. The view should not contain any logic, for example, and doesn't require any unit testing. That's the end of part 1. Let's summarize what we've done and look at where you can go to find more information about Sitecore MVC. Today we have looked at how you install and configure Sitecore MVC using the Sitecore installer. We've created a layout, and we've also set up a Visual Studio project to work with our MVC website. We've created an XSLT-like view rendering and seen how you can both dynamically and statically bind it to a layout. We also looked at creating a more complex controller rendering, and then we looked at some of the useful helpers that Sitecore give you to make sure that you're supporting the page editor. If you need more information about Sitecore MVC, there are 3 primary places where you can get it. You can look at the developer reference guide on the SDN, or you can look at the huge plethora of blog posts out there, and I've included a link here to John West's blog, which is a list of MVC resources, including videos that you can look at. As you get deeper into Sitecore MVC, you should also have a look at the Sitecore MVC contrib project on GitHub, which will solve some of the more complex challenges that you might encounter. That's all for part 1. Thank you for listening, and see you in part 2.